the audience for being still alive and paying attention to the last panel after the exhausting day. But I believe it was a very, very interesting day with very serious conversations. And let me start by saying that the very fact that a panel on the global economy is a necessary item on the agenda of a geopolitical conference like this one already explains the necessity for this discussion and the importance of the topic. What I mean by this is that trade, tariffs, and supply chains that used to be somewhat technical economic terms are now increasingly influenced by geopolitics, security concerns, and economic political bloc formation. So the consensus that we've seen for 3 decades, basically, that the global economy was built on integration, free trade, and financial openness is somewhat challenged. So we see that the world economy is becoming more and more political. I could start by asking you whether or not you see a tendency for bloc formation. But I think that some kind of economic bloc formation seems inevitable. So instead, I start by asking how high the fence will be among political economic blocs and how rigid those blocs will be. Or if I want to put it simply, my first question is, can politics dictate economic cooperation? And first, it's a round question, but first let's start with you, Ambassador Chinoy.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by making a few brief comments on what we've just heard. Professor Graham Allison, he showed a wonderful chart where there were potential conflict situations, some of which ended in war. And I can immediately relate to two as very fine examples of what happens when geopolitics and geoeconomics intersect. In one case, for example, when Portugal and Spain were at loggerheads, they decided to negotiate the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And they actually drew a line whereby they divided that everything to the west of that line in the Atlantic would be with Spain, and everything to the east of that line would be with Portugal. And then you also had a situation where the world being round as a hemisphere, the Spaniards, of course, went around and came out somewhere near the Philippines. And they had to go in for another treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529. And that averted war because they were negotiating. And they decided that in that contested space, which is now often referred to as the Indo-Pacific, the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, would be with Portugal, and Philippines would go to Spain. But there is another example where the intersection of geopolitics and geoeconomics resulted in war. In 1793, when Lord Macartney was sent by the British sovereign to Emperor Qianlong in China to ask China to open up to trade, he was obviously refused. And the Chinese said, we don't need anything that the West produces. And this later on resulted in transfer of silver from Britain to China, because all the silk and porcelain and various other items started coming from China, but Britain was not exporting anything. And it resulted, because there was no negotiation, it resulted in the opium trade. And when the Chinese tried to stop that, it resulted in war. So the fact of the matter is that where there are negotiations, there is less likelihood of conflict. And where there are no negotiations, where the feeling of unequal trade terms gives the impression of their being permanent or being adversarial to national security interests, there is inevitably war. Fortunately, right now, I believe that we are in a phase where there are negotiations. It's a fact of the matter a fact of life that the United States of America remains the preeminent power. And it is the one that's curated what we, with rose-tinted glasses, sometimes like to call the rules-based international order. It was never perfect. This RBIO, to start with, has a very high degree of inequality inherent in the United Nations, and yet, of course, we all adhere to the UN Charter. But the US is doing precisely what it is because it can do it. It has done it once in the past, in that Foschtchen bargain in 1945, when the UN Charter was itself adopted in exchange for something like the UN Security Council with permanent membership and vetoes, and we've all forgotten about that. So I would say that what we are seeing right now is nothing new. In fact, we have seen it throughout history that trade and the scrimmage for resources have always been at the heart of geopolitics. We saw it in the age of exploration. We have seen it in the age of colonization. We saw how the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were private entities, but they were soon followed by the flag. And I don't see any difference in what we are seeing today. In fact, the Vasco da Gamas and the Christopher Columbuses and the Magellans have simply been replaced by a new kind of 21st century private entrepreneur who works with state governments to ensure that there are advantages with regard to trade and resources.
So, Laszlo, do you think it's any different from what we've seen before, or we're really entering a new era of global economy?
So the initial question was, right, how high the fence will be, right? And if we want to answer this question, then we have to raise the question, who is building the fence now? And what are at stakes for those who are building the fence? And actually, it's the United States who is building the fence now for its own defense. But anytime the United States starts to build a fence, then China retaliates. And if the US is building the fence, and then we see that every retaliation hurts the United States more than what the benefits are from building a high fence, my answer to your question is that the fence will not be high, or at least not in the short run. Maybe in medium or long run, it can be a high fence, but definitely not in a short time period. Because building a fence, of course, is the United States hollowed out its industries. And if you build a high fence in the United States, then inflation will occur, people will suffer from inflation. It takes time to build up a new industry, and you're going to lose the next elections. So you cannot afford to have a high fence. But of course, in technologies, in disruptive technologies, in advanced technologies, there will be some high fences. And let's look at the case of India. I think India is doing great in creating their own platforms. If you want to enter the Indian market, you have to go through those platforms. And actually, China has its own platforms. India built its own platforms. The United States has its own platforms, but the European Union doesn't have its own platforms. So in brief, that's my answer to your question.
Andrew, is the fence going to be high, and is it in everyone's interest to keep it low or high?
Well, I think the Ambassador Chinoy was absolutely right, and thank you all for staying here to what I've been calling the graveyard shift panel, the wrap up at the end of the day. It's not whether we start building a fence. It's why did we ever stop building a fence when everybody else continued? I think one of the in our interminable Twitter wars on the internet, one of the most remarked changes among American conservatives, Republicans, President Trump's party, has been a perceived drift away from free market economics towards more protectionism, what we've called part of national conservatism. And that has happened for a variety of reasons, but at least domestically, it's because when we tried to have economics without politics, it's not like the other side stopped putting politics into economics, particularly during what we would call the peak woke era, and then the pandemic. Major corporations and the tech industry continued to politicize. They continued to make massive donations to NGOs and interest groups that and design their companies in such a way that their companies effectively promoted social causes. And I think a little bit, though that's a very domestic, parochial American interest, the same is true broadly. You know, one of the great revealed preferences of President Trump's second term in office, which I was privileged to serve in, has been that this trade relationship, particularly with China, has been elevated to the top national security interest of the United States, even more than European policy or balancing militarily, you know, China or even the Western Hemisphere. Again, there's a number of reasons for that, but clearly the continued use of economics by our allies and the use of non-tariff barriers and the implementation of non-tariff barriers against our companies at the same time when many of those countries were demanding our help on political security issues has had catastrophic consequences for Americans, manufacturing Americans and Americans in the middle class. And that what we call a interjection of politics into economics is more like a reunification to the same way everyone else is doing the same thing.
Fair enough, but
they started it, in other words, is my...
Fair enough, but let me have a more practical question to you first, Laszlo, and that is, in an increasingly politicized global economy, how can businesses keep up with this? Because if I think with the mind of a CEO who wants to, you know, just get profits, and if the politics, the geopolitics makes economy increasingly volatile and rapidly changing, then it's very hard to base long strategies for a business on those. So how can businesses keep up with such rapidly changing geopolitical environment? Especially you also mentioned Europe and we're here in Hungary. So for example, a Hungarian company or any other company in the world, how can we keep up with this?
It depends on which businesses you mean. The sound is very much echoing, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you a bit. I'm not blaming the United States for building a fence. I think it is in their vital interest to build a certain fence or a certain sized fence. The answer to your question is that the problem is actually that there was not enough, in my opinion, strategic governmental or political intervention in the markets, and businesses were very much efficiency maximizers and efficiency driven. And in the last 25 years, the United States created a system after the Second World War, unprecedented in my opinion in history. Maybe there were some exemptions as well, or some other examples as well. Unprecedented in history, from which it was not a colonizing world economic and world political system. The allies who understood the rules of the game could also win. But of course, the United States relatively won the most or benefited the most of this system. But in the last 25 years, if you look at the last 25 years, in a macro level, China benefited more relatively from this system than the United States, which is actually financing, created this system and financing this system, or was financing until President Trump is stepping out of some international organizations, 66 actually. But the problem is that businesses in the last 25 years from the United States were still efficiency driven and still benefited a lot from the global economy, but it was not the national interest of the United States. And the United States hollowed out. So, I mean, industry disappeared from the United States. I have a friend from Hungary who is a CEO of a large and vice president of a large Taiwanese company here in Hungary. And he was assigned to build a new factory in Texas recently. And he's suffering from the lack of industrial capacities and capabilities in the United States. So for businesses, from large businesses who benefit from globalization, they would continue this efficiency-driven approach. But it's not pro-United States, not pro the national interest, not pro the middle classes, not pro the American society and American middle classes. And I think, in my opinion, the United States should have started earlier with its politics, its approach to be less efficiency-driven and more resilience-driven, as we see now. I hope I was understandable, not misunderstood.
We already are touching upon the U.S. reindustrialization and the somewhat protectionist steps as a reaction to what you just described. And I'd like to cite Samir Saran, who yesterday said in his opening remarks that tariff is the implication of the economic arrangement itself that had allowed for unsustainable practices. So let's talk a little bit about tariffs and the reindustrialization in the U.S. And my first question is to you, Andrew. So the U.S.'s tariffs, it can be argued that in the short run, they mean basically income for the state. On the other hand, there is a narrative that in the longer run, it's not only the stock exchange, but the US dollar itself that becomes more politically volatile and influenced by political decisions and these tariffs. What's your take on this reasoning? Do you think it actually jeopardizes the US dollar's global position, or on the other hand, it actually helps it?
I'm not worried about the tariffs as affecting the dollar as a global reserve currency. I mean, the U.S. market is so large that countries will always want to do business in the U.S. It's not a kind of convenience by norm as our financial system is. I think what has put the greatest amount of risk into the dollar as reserve currency is the convenience of sanctions as a kind of catch-all tool to achieve major geopolitical ends. You know, I was fortunate enough to be Graham Allison's teaching assistant when I was in college, and watching him on the screen really brings back all the times when I didn't do as good a job correcting papers as I should have, and he had to give me like a stern talking to. But he used to say that there was the one terrible memo in government was the 3-option memo, where option 1 is nuclear war, option 3 is surrender, and then there's option B, right, the reasonable choice. That's the laziest, worst way to write a government memo. And sanctions for us have become a kind of option B memo, right? We don't want to attack problem, we don't want to ignore problem, so we'll put sanctions on Russia's energy industry about some of their bond issue and restrict that to certain out years, and we'll call that a policy that we can cite in front of Congress. So that has been the systemic risk with that to the dollar status, not really the tariffs, which has to do with the attractiveness of the domestic market, which is still immense.
Still, I want a little bit of discussion on the global finance and the dollar as the leading currency. And I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Chinoy, do you think there could be an alternative to the US dollar? And if so, when and what?
So from my point of view, for the foreseeable future, the answer is no. Because when you look at the facts of the case, you find that almost 47%, 48% of global transfers today are still made in the US dollar. Although the US dollar, in terms of accounting for foreign exchange reserves, etc., has come down a notch or two from about 70% to about 58%, it is still in that high range. Whereas when you look at, for example, the putative alternative of the renminbi, that is the Chinese yuan, it accounts only for 3 to 4% of all global transfers. And about 80% of China's own transfers are in US dollars. So for me, it's a no-brainer that for the foreseeable future, there is absolutely no challenge to the US dollar, and particularly so in regard to commodities and such other trade. Now, if I could just chip in a little bit on the fences that you spoke about, I think the fences that can be built or are being attempted are more in the high technology space, because that's where you have the muscle of big tech and supported by governments in the play. Trade is more fungible and it's not conducted out of the Pentagons or the State Departments all the time. And therefore, it's much more difficult to control trade and build fences there. Some attempt is being made with regard to energy. Energy trade is something that's been caught up in this, but you can see that overall the whole idea of de-risking from China broadly, I would say, has failed to some extent, because even countries that had some tensions with the People's Republic, and I should say that for a while I might include my own country, though there is a thaw underway, and that is a welcome feature. But whether it's the United States, China, Japan, Australia, you name it, and de-risking was not all that feasible. So we have to keep this in mind. But one point about dollar and dominance and things like that, I think this whole idea of the United States trying to scrub China out of the Western Hemisphere is something that needs to be studied a little more carefully, because that is going to result in the People's Republic with its extra and excess capacities and vast need to export, concentrating even more on, for example, Asia or the Indo-Pacific, where the United States itself is a very big player, about $4.1 trillion worth of trade and about $1 trillion worth of investments. And so if the US succeeds in scrubbing China out of the Western Hemisphere, and the US itself demands its own presence in the Indo-Pacific, as it has when you read the State Department's agency strategic plan for 2026-2030, there's going to be tension in the Indo-Pacific on account of the conflict of interests.
Thanks for citing that document, because we will continue with that. The US State Department has published its agency strategic plan, which you just cited, 2026 to 2030. And it claims a lot of things, but one thing I'll like to cite is that the US diplomacy's success is measured by its contribution to US economic security. So that is the key KPI for US diplomacy. It's US economic security. And it also says that the State Department is basically a tool for enhancing national sovereignty rather than global integration. So we see a United States that is more pragmatic and transactional in a sense, and also one that only does integration when it has very direct benefits from it. So my first question is to you, Andrew, because it says that diplomacy is measured by the success. The diplomacy's success is measured by economic benefits. Is the current Trump administration's diplomatic steps, for example, the peace plans for Gaza or Ukraine, how do these aspirations enhance economic benefits to the U.S.?
Well, I think stabilizing the political and security situations in both Gaza and Ukraine will have immense economic benefits, not just because the countries involved will be able to stop paying into them in terms of arming one side or the other, but also because the natural and the human resources of these areas can finally be unlocked or released to the world. I think the benefits are self-evident. Where the great theoretical question underpinning that is, after the collapse of the Washington Consensus and the kind of post-Cold War belief that prosperity springs from democracy and from liberal government, we now have a job to prove again that democracies, liberal governments, the United States, Hungary, Norway, Japan, can produce stable, prosperous, rapidly growing countries for their citizens. Graham Allison mentioned China a moment ago. And Lee Kuan Yew, fantastically, the great success story of China has not been that it has grown so quickly, but that it has totally turned over the political consensus that you need to be freer or more open or more responsive to do so. It hasn't. In fact, it's probably gone the other way. answering that theoretical question of what is the relationship of government type and values to economic prosperity for the most of your citizens possible, the biggest majority of your citizens, is I think the key question that underpins the Trump administration's national security strategy and the document that the ambassador mentioned.
Laszlo, what do you think is the European perspective on not just the document, but the general approach of the Trump administration on this one?
Probably negative.
You mean the national security
Yeah,
plan?
the national security strategy and also the approach towards this more pragmatic economic cooperation and less interventionalist, less value-driven.
Well, if you just want a brief answer, some say that it was written by us. I mean, by the Hungarian government or the government advisors or the prime minister, because, well, it's so obvious and so clearly, precisely hits the nail on the head, I think, this national security plan strategy. And the United States badly needed such a pragmatic national security strategy long time ago. So you've been talking about liberal democracies and prosperity and the correlation between them. Let me be honest, I'm not finding the right word, but it has nothing to do. We already experienced that actually the state capacity to organize itself and organize its economy is more vital and more important than being liberal or democratic, as we can see in the last few decades. And I just clearly don't understand why the United States didn't have such a national security strategy in the past. I mean, how can, so when the East Coast and West Coast trades to maritime routes through Panama Canal, how can it happen that the ports or the port is controlled by Chinese there? How can it happen? How can it happen that the American resilience, the American industry hollows out? And I think it is a good signal. So you asked, and I'm turning to your question, and I will be very brief. What does it mean for Europe? That Europe also should turn towards pragmatism. So can we protect ourselves? Can we provide us with national security? Can we maintain the order of our societies? And can we provide from our resilient industry perspective to provide our people with competitive goods and services? And if I have to answer these questions from European perspective, I think we are very much constrained by ideology-driven thinking, and we should learn from the national security strategy of the United States, and we should learn from a very similar strategy from China and India as well.
What's the perspective of the Global South, Ambassador Chinoy?
Oh, well, if I were to say something about the EU, I would say that there's been an epiphany, an awakening of sorts, because political collaboration, time has discovered, is not necessarily political integration, despite the fact that it has had a very, very exciting journey, going back, for example, to the Treaty of Rome, which set up the EEC, and then you had the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and you have the EU, and then you have the Euro. So it's a very exciting journey. But I think along the way, people have lost sight of the fact that political collaboration is not necessarily political integration of the type that reduces one's sovereignty to a zero. In fact, we are sitting in a country that is obviously exercising its strategic autonomy while being in the heart of Europe. So I think this is a very, very difficult time for Europe in a certain sense, because there have been three great realizations. One, that outsourcing all security to the United States is a mistake, and all you have to do is to read Rearming Europe at 2030 to tell you how keen they are now to integrate their defense industrial complex and procurements and acquisitions and logistics and not to have to depend for all times to come on the United States. The second thing that they've realized is it's a huge mistake to rely entirely on the Russian Federation for energy. And the third mistake they seem to have woken up to is it's also a huge mistake to outsource all manufacturing to the People's Republic of China. Now, the problem is that Trump's policies and this great dose of uncertainty and flux that he has introduced plays out even more dramatically and in an insidious manner when it is among friends. Among friends, it's the hardest to resolve. And I think when you look at the policies now outlined in the National Security Strategy 2025 or the National Defense Strategy of 2026 or this paper that you referred to, which is the State Department's Agency Strategic Plan for 2630, in fact, you see that the US is very clear about China as an adversary. If it's not very clear to you in the NSS, for that matter, not even in the NDS, all you have to do is read the last one, that is the Agency Strategic Plan. And China is mentioned in virtually every paragraph in the context of the US wanting to reindustrialize or strengthen its defense industrial complex, etc. So that's hard enough, but with Europe, I think it's also become very difficult, this tariff war. And my country, for example, has done exceptionally well to maintain strategic autonomy throughout. By the way, strategic autonomy is not something that you wake up to one morning and say, I now want it. I know it's a splendid speech by Mr. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos, speaking about strategic autonomy and middle powers and all that. That's something that India has been saying for ages, and we have lived it. It's very hard for a strategic alliance partner like Canada to now try to exercise what very noble sentiments expressed by Mr. Carney. So I think it's going to get interesting here on, but countries like India seem to have done very well. We've signed, some would say, the mother of all deals with the EU. We want to do much more with the EU. And some would say we've signed the father of all deals with the United States of America and brought down our own tariffs to a reasonable level. Now, I think it's futile for people to say, oh, but the United States still imposes 18% on you. Look, that's a fact. And, that's what you call the existing power quotient or disparity in the world. It's a reality. History is replete with such examples, and we jolly well get used to it and negotiate our way through this, And for a country like mine to maintain strategic autonomy, to have good relations with the EU, to have good relations with the US, and also to have good relations with our northern neighbor, the People's Republic of China.
Let me have a follow-up question to you. So with the, and maybe it's a more abstract question, but so with the US backing out from global economic integration, unless it sees a direct benefit from it, does this make integration as a notion somewhat pointless or outdated globally, or it actually pushes other nations together to integrate within themselves?
Look, you're asking me this question. I'd say integration is both possible and very difficult. Let's take a few examples. You have today, for example, the EU. It's an example of a form of integration, and yet you have fractures on key security issues, key economic issues as well, including energy, including Ukraine. And we've been hearing it, the whole day. But you also have problems when you look at integration in terms of, for example, large, complex mechanisms like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, or the CPTPP. Now, both these, when you look at it on the face of it, are kind of good ideas for integration. The US is in neither of them. For that matter, India is also not in either of them. So if you don't have the largest economy in the world, $30 trillion economy, participating in the CPTPP, which of course is much smaller in terms of population, in terms of GDP, in terms of wherewithal. It is roughly half that of, or less than that of, the RCEP. But if the biggest economy in the world is not participating, then I think their future is kind of intrinsically limited. So I think the US knows this. It's trying to press the reset button on a global order, which it itself midwifed in 1945, knows that it is not etched in stone. We may think it's etched in stone. The US doesn't think it's etched in stone, and it believes that it has the right, based on power disparity, to change that to its advantage. So while that game is going on, I think real integration along blocks and things like that will be very difficult. What is possible in the realm of possibility is for bilateral, trilateral, regional FTAs, and that's a game being played out today. And you can also have what we broadly call middle powers. I don't agree with this definition. Middle powers is a very large spectrum, very hard to say that we all belong to one particular category there. But let's say that we speak about those that are in between. They have now a chance, through such regional FTAs, to try and be the lodestar for the lesser economies in their immediate neighborhood. This, of course, presupposes that their own rise is supported by a wider consensus in the region. That is obviously very important. So a certain kind of reassurance to smaller neighbors and all that is very important. By the way, ASEAN is also not a terribly successful experiment in integration, because we have seen that within ASEAN there are quite a few differences on security issues, and now increasingly on economic issues with regard to the CLM countries and the kind of dependence that they have developed on China, for example.
With all this in mind, how can Europe even try to maneuver with this intrinsic conflict between, economic conflict between the US and China?
We are in a very difficult situation. We are in a catch-22 situation, because from security perspective, we are dependent on the United States. From welfare point of view, so from green and digital transformation or transition, how we call it in Europe, even Ursula von der Leyen said that Europe is, to the extent of 98%, exposed to China. So our problem is very similar to America's problem in terms of lack of strategic and pragmatic thinking in the last 25 years. So to answer your question, there are 5 values in the basic law of Hungary, in the constitution of the United States, France, Germany, India as well, explicitly written down, that politics has to provide their societies, their citizens, security, order, freedom, justice, and welfare. And actually, we in Europe suffering from lack of security or capability of being secure. We are stagnating, we have welfare problems, we have order problems, internal order problems, which are generating justice and freedom related value disruptions. So how can we balance? We don't want to call it protectionism, we call it strategic autonomy. And I see a lot of materials, a lot of strategic materials being created in the European Commission, but every strategy is worth only that much as it is executable. And I don't see now a clear European strategy that is executable. That is why I see the European Commission like a pendulum swinging from one strategy to another and creating newer and newer strategies, but never reflecting back on the outcomes.
Let's have a concluding question, and I'll ask this to all of you. First to you, Andrew. So how do you see the future of global economy in 10 years? And if you had to define one thing that will decide the fate of the global economy, what would it be in the upcoming decade?
Well, that's such a good question. I tend to be a tense pessimist about this. I think we are heading for immense societal challenges in all the developed world because of several factors such as the inequality of wealth, probably above all, that's going to be accelerated by artificial intelligence, and the populist movements of the right and left that are springing up because the existing institutional framework of Europe and the United States isn't necessarily set up the right way to integrate what people want into the political system. You know, when we talk about the rise of China, my mind's still on China because Graham just gave that talk about that. One of the things that's always given us confidence in the West is that our systems evolve and adapt faster than the Soviets or the Chinese or whoever, right? That's the benefit of being in the West vice being in a communist state. But one of the reasons the creeping unfreeness, what Sarah Rogers was talking about last night, the restrictions on free speech, the restrictions on political choice, that makes our systems less able to adapt and reflect people's wills and takes away our main advantage as a competitor. So as I said, I'm tense and deeply pessimistic about the next few years. I don't know what this human desire for something that the system is not providing will look like, but whatever it is, it's going to be different than what we have now, except maybe in Hungary.
And do you have a specific recommendation to our future selves, to the either to a specific country or just in general to humanity, and how to avoid a horrible conflict, a mad situation, as Graham Allison said?
I think the most effort possible to ensure that all voices are reflected in the political system is of the utmost importance. I cannot stress that enough, because when they're not, the system starts looking illegitimate, their internal coercive mechanisms start looking illegitimate, and that's when you have revolutionary change.
The same question to you, Laszlo. So how do you envision the next decade from a global economic standpoint, and what's the one thing that will determine the fate of the world in this sense, in your opinion?
Can you repeat it?
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
hear you.
So how do you envision the next 10 years, or how you envision the world 10 years from now, from a global economic standpoint? And what do you think is the one thing that will determine the most how it will look like?
Okay. Until now, I will probably criticizing the European Commission's policies on how to strengthen the European economy, and I told it's a catch-22 situation. But there are some good initiatives. I think we should learn from the Chinese. So when you enter the Chinese economy or industry, the European, American, and any other companies had to create joint ventures just to keep part of the profits within and integrate the technology into your economy. Now we see, based on an ESPI's measurement of technological advancement, that China is leading in 66 or 67 technologies out of 74 technologies, ahead of the United States and any other countries in terms of patents and top 10% scientific papers. So we have to do the same if we want to integrate and incorporate their know-how and technology into our economy. First thing. The second thing, you've been talking about, Andrew, about rising inequalities within the societies, and that's true. And now it will be an advertisement. I wrote a book titled The Middle Class Revolution, with a foreword from Prime Minister Viktor Orban. So it's worth to read, probably. It was published by World Scientific Publishing, where I give a possible solution of strengthening the middle classes all around the world, but mostly in Europe and in Western societies. We have some hidden resources that we are not tapping, because many of our democratic governments are captured by some big business groups. We were brave enough to go against the tide, and we taxed the rent seekers, the monopolistic, oligopolistic companies, which benefited from crisis, from the Russian-Ukrainian war, mostly the energy companies, crisis like the COVID, the banking sector, the retail sector after the jump up from the COVID. And we also taxed the SMEs, which were tax avoiders or tax optimizers, mostly in the informal economy. We decreased their taxes and created digital solutions to tax them. And we also revised our social security system and told the people who are healthy enough just to go back to work. And we also helped them to get back to work with public work programs and with training programs. And with this, we are redistributing 5% of our GDP from the rent seekers, from the speculators who are actually hacking the system, to those who are contributing to the system, undertaking children, enterprising, or working. And that's how we strengthened our middle classes. There are many untapped rent seekers in the European Union, which if the governments are brave enough to tax, they can turn this money into industrial development and strengthen Europe and make Europe more resilient and really put resources into the strategic autonomy of the European Union without becoming hugely indebted because they found their resources.
So we hit the resources. That's great to know. Last words, Ambassador Chinoy, same question. So what's your vision for the next decade? And what is the most determining factor that you wish to touch upon?
So look, I'm not a crystal ball gazer, and it's very difficult to look 10 years ahead. These days, if you can see 6 months ahead,
9 maybe.
You're very lucky if you get it right. Now, I think the power disparity, economic and military, is going to be compounded over the next decade. And the world will begin to operate, in my view, as I see it, at 3 different levels. There will be the phenomenon of unipolarity exercised by the United States on certain matters, particularly trade tariffs and semiconductors and things like that, chips, etc. There is going to be a bipolarity also available at the same time between the United States and China, where in that space there will be give and take, semiconductors and GPUs for critical minerals, etc. And then there's going to be the others, the vast majority, the global south, in that fractured kind of simultaneously coexisting world where there will be a degree of multipolarity. Having said that, let me say that the one particular factor that is going to impact the world and crack it up into clubs is AI. Those that have power, those that have computing power and cloud and data and software and all that, and electricity, they are going to be in an exclusive club right at the top. There is going to be another layer where there will be the sort of have-nots, and they will exist in a world of their own, relying more on domestic consumption, exporting to one another, manufactured goods, etc., in order to survive in an AI-driven global economy. So I think the next decade will be extremely, extremely interesting. And unless there is a broad consensus on sharing, global finance, reforming the IMF, decision-making structures, providing technology to the global south, AI, etc., will have to be made more fungible. And India is going to host the AI Impact Summit, where people, planet, and prosperity are the themes. So it's got to be available to the rest of the world. Otherwise, we're looking at very, very rapidly descending into AI colonization.
These were actually very specific predictions. And I think it kind of opened a new panel discussion, and we could go on for another hour only by discussing the things that you just mentioned in your last couple of sentences. But unfortunately, we ran out of time. So I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today. And I'd like to yield the floor back to the host.
So with that, this edition of the Budapest Global Dialogue comes to a close. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of both the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and the Observer Research Foundation, thank you for joining us here in Budapest to press for answers to some of the most important issues of our time. We hope that you leave inspired and having learned something new. And we also hope to see you again at the next edition of the Budapest Global Dialogue. Before we go, let's give a big round of applause for all of the staff members who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event possible for the third time. And now we'll have a closing dinner, which will take place in the atrium of the hotel, across the restaurant where we had lunch. You can get there by exiting these doors, heading down the stairs, and then turning left. Our staff will be available, though, to help guide you. With that, enjoy the rest of your night.